Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The Associated Student Speakers Program is honored to have as its guest today the Honorable Edmund G. Pat Brown, former Governor of California. One of the enjoyable benefits of having a man of such preeminence as a speaker is that his introduction need not be lengthy. He's had, as we all know, a long and distinguished political career. His progressive record, especially in the fields of education and social welfare, is also well known. I would like to correct one little thing that was in the Daily Bruin today. We will have a question and answer period which will follow immediately after the governor's presentation in the grand ballroom. Without further ado, speaking on Let's Get the Politicians Out of Government, former Governor Brown.
Thank you very, very much. Let me at the very outset tell you that any relationship between the title that I've given and the speech will be purely coincidental. The way it happened, he called me several weeks ago and asked me whether I'd come out here and make this talk, and I said I'd be very, very happy to do it. And he said, well, give me a title, and that was the only thing I could think of because I'd been reading in the papers so much in recent days that politicians were just bad human beings that I thought that's a good title. That may bring a few more people to this meeting. You know, I've been out of government now, not out of politics, but out of the governorship for about a year. And you know, as governor, you have an airplane with 4 pilots, you have a chauffeur that drives you around, you have the mansion up there, even though the incumbent governor has moved out of it. It's really rather a nice and pleasant place, and the price is right too. And then you're back with the common people again, and you're back driving your own car. Your wife is doing the cooking. People don't recognize you as you walk along the street, and people say, well, how do you like it? I mean, are you really enjoying yourself? Don't you miss the fame and notoriety? And I can only tell them that, you know, as governor, I would pick up the papers every single day, and there'd be a story, UNRRA wraps Brown, Republicans wrap Brown, Yorty blast Brown, and you pick it up and you cringe. Every day you kind of hold yourself back. You don't know what to say, and as a matter of fact, I stopped one paper up in Sacramento because it ruined my breakfast, and I enjoyed the breakfast very much. And then what happens? I get out of office. Every time I pick up the paper, there it is: wrap Brown, wrap Brown. So I'm in a plane the other day, and who walks along the street, but who walks along, and I saw him walk out ahead of me, but I got on the plane before he did. I said, who's that? They said, that's Rap Brown. So as he walked by in the plane, I said, pardon me. I said, Brother Brown. I said, my name's Pat Brown. I said, would you please change your name? I said, you're wrecking my breakfast every morning, every time I read about you. Now, you may think that's an exaggeration, but it's a true story. Now, I'm very, very thankful to be here today. I wasn't quite sure when I was introduced whether he'd introduce me as the former Governor Brown as he did. I thought he might say the ex-governor, or maybe I was talking down in Orange County the other day, and they said the late Mr. Brown. But what I'd really rather be called, I'm leading a seminar here in political science, and I really was kind of hoping that he'd introduce me as Professor Edmund G. Brown. Now, the last time that I sat down with so many UCLA students was at that football game 2 weeks ago. And let me add, before the sit-in starts, that I was rooting for the Bruins. I've always been a supporter of the tuition-free university. The week after the big game, there was an interview with Gary in the Los Angeles Times. I read that paper now. I rather like it. He said it was they have an excellent cartoonist. He is really, really outstanding. But in that interview, he said it was very discouraging to watch the films of the USC game when he already knew what was coming next. All I can say to Gary is that I've been studying the films of my last game for more than a year now, and it is discouraging. But Gary can take some small comfort from the fact that his team only lost by 1 point. I lost by almost 1 million. Now, I know that the memory of the Trojan game is painful, but I raise it only to point up a parallel between football and politics. Whether the opponent is the USC or the GOP, there's always a next year. Now, I don't know how many of you here are Republicans or how many of you are Democrats, and I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands. I made that mistake at USC once, and I could hardly find the courage to go on. But whatever our political faith may be, I think it would be of interest to all of us to examine the impact on California and on this university of the Reagan Brown game of 1966. They say that history has a value only if we apply its lessons to the future. And believe me, there is much that we can learn from the California elections of 1966 and their aftermath that can have a decisive impact on the political future of both our state and the nation. But before I go into that, let me answer a question that's asked me very often. Whom do I blame for losing to Ronald Reagan by almost 1 million votes in a state with an overwhelming Democratic majority? My good friend and the USC alumnus Jess Unruh? No. My old sidekick Sam Yorty? No. You know, I blame it on Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It was all his fault. It was his fault for initiating the social and economic reforms that have given America the highest standard of living in the world. And that standard of living, that affluence, has made it almost impossible today to distinguish between a Democrat and a Republican in suburban America. Now, in order that none of you will interpret this as a serious criticism of one of our nation's greatest presidents, I must tell you that FDR was playing havoc with political affiliations as far back as 1933. In that year, a young San Francisco Republican took a look at I got any water here? I'm not used to making speeches. I'm losing my voice. Going back, Franklin D. Roosevelt played a real part in the changing of political affiliations back in 1933. In that year, a young San Francisco Republican took a look at FDR and the hope and the courage of the New Deal and said to himself, "This is for me." And he promptly changed his registration from Republican to Democrat. And I've been a Democrat ever since. But now to return to my original point. In the early 1930s, America was in the depths of a Great Depression. There were bread lines and soup kitchens in our major cities. Veterans of World War I were selling apples on street corners. After too many years of Republican indifference, the Democrats took over and became the champion of the little guy, or as FDR put it, the common man. Our enemies at that time were the economic royalists, the very wealthy who were against the rights of unions to organize, against Social Security, against federal projects of every kind. In those days, the poor were the majority in this country, and FDR's actions were of direct economic benefit to that majority. In the 1930s, to vote your own economic self-interest was to vote Democratic. What do we find more than 30 years later? We find that a majority of Americans are affluent. They own their own home, either in the city or in suburbia. They have at least 2 cars in every garage, sons and daughters in college, a color TV set in the den next to the hi-fi and the wet bar. Most of them still register Democratic. But in California, 1 out of every 3 Democrats will vote Republican. Now, why do they do that? For the same reason that they would vote Democratic in the 1930s or the 1940s. He believes it to be in his economic self-interest. He identifies the Democratic Party with spending, with social legislation that he must pay for with his tax dollars, but from which he individually derives no direct benefit. In the past, he would vote yes on the school bond issue because he had youngsters in school, but now he'll vote no. Why should he pay for the education of children who are not his own? In the past, he was a member of a labor union. He would vote for a candidate who was not hostile to unions. But now, his economic future more secure, he will vote against that candidate because the pro-union candidate today is almost always identified with other liberal causes, all of which could increase their taxes. In other words, he has his. Let the other fellow scramble for himself. Now, I don't mean to oversimplify this picture. Very often, of course, there are other factors at work in the other interests other than the economic self-interest, or what such voters imagine to be their economic self-interest. There was, without question, a mass defection from Democratic ranks over the fair housing issue in California. A majority of those who have come to California from other states in the past 10 to 15 years have come from the southern states. Traditionally, they are Democrats, and they register Democratic when they get here. But let a Democratic candidate propose that Negroes should be given the right to live wherever they can afford to live, and such voters will turn against him faster than they can say George Wallace. There is no question in my mind, for example, that Pierre Salinger lost his Senate seat to George Murphy because Proposition 14 was on the same ballot as that Senate race. Salinger had the courage to take a position in favor of the Rumford Act. Murphy took no position at all, but to many voters, Murphy's cynical avoidance of the issue was preferable to Salinger's clear-cut statement of principle. I should add that the fair housing fight was not only a racial question, but one that also involved what voters thought to be, once again, and I repeat it, their own economic self-interest. They really believed, all of the evidence to the contrary, that a Negro family on their block would drastically reduce their property values. For all of these reasons, I did very badly in the upper middle class suburbia last year. I did very well in the lower middle class and minority communities. In other words, I got the votes of the have-nots and the liberals of all economic levels. Mr. Reagan got the votes of the haves and the conservatives, 1/3 of them Democrats. It is important for you to understand that this was not merely a California phenomenon last year. Other Democratic governors, Democratic congressmen, Democratic legislators also were the casualties of what was clearly a national trend. This is not to suggest that the race between Mr. Reagan and myself did not have its own unique and exotic aspects. It did, but they were not persuasive in the final outcome. What we saw in last year's election was a national trend a trend that I can best describe as a revolt of Democrats against the traditional concepts of their own party. And the result, very clearly, is that the Democratic Party is now the minority party in many major states, despite its strong voter representation. Now, what is the significance of all this? What does it portend for next year when we will elect not only a president, but a new Congress, not only governors, but new legislators, people that will influence your lives in many, many different ways? What does it portend also at times when we must take Mr. Reagan seriously as a presidential candidate? And I'm afraid that we must. It portends, I believe, an America that will turn its face cynically from the poor, an America that will underestimate tragically both the strength and the rightness of the Negro cause, an America that will question its ability to educate its young or to grant greater security to the old. It doesn't have to happen, and I'm hopeful that it won't. But there's only one way that I can see, and I've thought about it a great deal. The only way to stop it is still to appeal to the economic self-interest and to confront honestly the social and economic evils that still persist in this nation. I would prefer, very frankly, that we might appeal to the conservatives of both parties on better grounds, that we might say to him simply, let us do these things because it's right that we should. But that won't work. I tried it last year, but we must say to him pragmatically that it is more expensive to do it your way. To those in government and out, we must say that every dollar you wish to slash from the war on poverty will cost you $10 in higher welfare and law enforcement costs. We must tell them and then convince them that every dollar they save by turning students away from the public universities will cost them $10 in the eventual earning power and the eventual higher taxes that they will pay by being university graduates. We must tell them that every dollar they cut from the budget of our mental hospitals will cost them $10 in longer institutional time for the patients. We must tell them and convince them very simply that concern and compassion are not only good government, but good economics too. It sounds rather harsh, I know, to put a dollar sign on human distress. But if you can think of a better way to humanize the policies of my successor in Sacramento, I'd like to know what it is. If you've been observing Mr. Reagan's performance over the past year, perhaps you'll agree with me that he is appealing directly and deliberately to the affluent majority. Now, this may be good politics. It may be good politics for the moment. But I can tell you, after 23 years in government, that it's bad government in the long run. And let me give you 2 or 3 examples. Early in this administration, the new governor demanded a 10% cut across the board in every department of the state. And this in the face of a certain increase this year of more than 500,000 citizens in our state. The results of this action did not always reach the headlines. Very seldom did it do it. But its effect, for instance, in our effort to rehabilitate the narcotic addict has been shattering. I began a program in California, which is now being copied by the federal government and the state of New York, which treats the addict not as a criminal, but as a person who is sick, a person who is as sick as a person that has tuberculosis or brain damage or any other kind of disease, but a person who will and has responded to therapeutic treatment. We don't lock them up for many years as we once did, but we commit them to a rehabilitation center at Corona where they receive both medical and therapeutic treatment. When we think they're ready for another try on the streets, we release them to go back to their families. But believe me when I tell you, the key to the success of this concept is intensive supervision. The addict receives a weekly Nalgene test after he gets out that would expose him to the continued use of heroin. He must attend weekly group counseling sessions. He must stay in regular contact with his parole agent. Now, this is a much more exacting parole than we require for releases from the conventional penal institutions. It has to be if we're going to keep that parolee on the streets. Now, during my administration, it was agreed that a narcotic parole officer cannot effectively handle a caseload of more than 30. But because of Mr. Reagan's across-the-board slash, the state is not replacing a majority of the parole agents who retire or resign. Today, the average caseload is 45, an increase of 50%. It is absolutely predictable that the rate of failure on parole will have to increase, and the small sum that Mr. Reagan will save in parole agent salaries will be tremendously offset by the cost of maintaining hundreds of addicts in an institution who might have made it on the outside if they had the adequate supervision. It's not a big story. You won't find it on page 1 or any other place, but it is a typical example of savings that are not savings at all. Now, another point is the closing, for economy reasons, of 2 state forestry lookout stations in Orange County. They just weren't there when a major brush fire broke out in that territory recently. When you measure the trifling savings from closing the lookouts against the tremendous loss of property in that fire, you have to wonder where economy ends and common sense begins. Mr. Reagan's attitude towards the University of California is another good case in point. Shortly after taking office, he told an unbelieving board of regents that they'd have to cut the university budget by 30%. He demanded this in the face of an enrollment increase of 10,000 over the previous year. He demanded it at a time when Governor Nelson Rockefeller of New York was asking for a 27% increase in the university budget, at a time when Governor John Connally of Texas was asking for a 92% increase in the university budget, at a time when that champion of intellectual freedom, Governor Lester Maddox of Georgia, was asking for a 39% increase in his university's budget. Thank God Mr. Reagan did not have his way. There was a cut in there was a cut in the university budget, a cut that has already had a damaging effect, but it was nothing like the 30% he originally set out to save, and the word save is in quotes, believe me. What did Mr. Reagan do next? He said that it was time for California to abandon its 99-year tradition of tuition-free higher education. He said it was time for the majority to stop subsidizing the education of the minority, and you are a minority. The sons and daughters of most of the families of California in this state are not attending the universities, and they're not attending the state colleges of our state. Mr. Reagan thought that a tuition of $400 a year might be just right for a starter. But again, the regents would not hold still for it. And then last week we had the latest word. To appease the governor, a committee of regents will recommend a yearly tuition of between $150 and $200. But Mr. Reagan won't call it tuition. He prefers to call it a student fee. The student fees are already the student, and you know this better than I, are paying an average of about $250 a year. Add to that the minimum extra you'll have to pay next year, $150, and you have a total of $400. The increase in a budget of $5 billion will save Mr. Reagan $18 million. And again, I put the word save in quotes. But it will place the University of California among the 10 most expensive public universities in America. In defense of the indefensible, Mr. Reagan says that the higher student fees actually will increase the university's enrollment of Negro and Mexican American students. His logic completely escapes me. Unless he turns the $18 million over to scholarships, there is no way that he can substantially increase the minority enrollment. And what are those minorities who are already on the campus, who would not qualify for scholarships, and whose parents could not afford the higher student fee? No, Mr. Reagan is not telling the truth. The effect of imposing tuition, and that's what it is, and there's no way out of it, will be to reduce the enrollment of students from poorer families. And let me put it another way. If Mr. Reagan were sincere in his declarations, the action that he should take is very clear. He should abase the amount of student fees on the ability of parents to pay. Perhaps no fees at all for students of parents who have an income of less than $8,000 a year, with a graduated scale of fees for the sons and daughters of those that are earning a great deal of money. Please believe me, I'm against that too. I'm not in favor of a means test to go to the University of California. I'm against any form of tuition. But I point this alternative, only to suggest that my successor is really not sincere. To justify tuition by insisting that it will benefit those least able to pay is the worst kind of double talk. I don't like what's happening to the university, and not simply because I believe that a BA degree is the minimum education that you must have in this complex world of ours. I don't like what's happening because I believe that it is not only bad government, but it's bad economics. Those of you who go into the professions or any of the other disciplines for which you're studying will more than repay the state in taxes from your higher incomes in the years ahead. We are doing it today in the taxes that we're paying for the free education we received when we were going to college. Higher education, in my opinion, is the best possible investment of the public dollar. But there are other economic consequences far beyond the greater tax contribution of the university graduate. The existence of this university and the impressive caliber of its faculty are one of California's greatest economic assets. We've led the nation in research and development contracts because of the brain power to be found on the 9 campuses of this university. And let me give you just one example. We announced back in 1960 that we would build a new campus at Irvine. In the 5 years between that announcement and the opening of the first classroom, more than 90 research and development companies built new plants and laboratories near the campus. Now, why did they invest in California? One reason might be that we have more Nobel laureates here in California than there are in the entire Soviet bloc of nations. I don't believe, very frankly, that budget slashes and tuition and punitive action toward student political activists are likely to perpetuate this academic atmosphere. Now, one final point. Mr. Reagan has immediately at hand a clear solution to the university's fiscal problem that would require neither tuition nor further cuts in the budget. And don't misunderstand me in any of these things that I'm saying. Government has to be economical. It has to be efficient. Every budget, every one of the 8 budgets that we prepared, we had to prune and cut because we had to run an efficient and economic government. But some of these are beyond all reason, and we tried to cut it down in the governor's office, in the legislative halls. And it can be avoided. And it can be avoided by a payroll withholding system for state income taxes that would produce almost $100 million a year, and without increasing the present rate of income taxes. Think of it. It would continue to produce millions more in state revenues every year, and not from those who are already paying their taxes, but from the 10% in this state who are now evading it. But Mr. Reagan is against withholding. He says he wants to collect the tax in a couple of big chunks every year. It should hurt to pay taxes, he insists, and it won't hurt if we collect it in small amounts. Now, I don't know whether the policy of his is hurting the taxpayer, but this much is certain. It is hurting this university. Now, if all of this is so evident, and I think that it is, then why is Mr. Reagan flying in the face of California's economic self-interest? My answer, quite frankly, is that I don't believe he believes in the principle of state assistance to those who cannot afford a higher education. He doesn't believe in that any more than he believes in the principle of state assistance to the aged poor who don't qualify for Medicare. He doesn't believe in it any more than he believes in the principle that we have an obligation in a growing state to acquire more beaches and more parks for a 40 million population that we'll have within 20 years. And when it adds up, what it all adds up to is this. Mr. Reagan just doesn't believe that California can afford to continue those investments which have made this state the best place in America to live, to work, and to raise children. He's quite right in one respect. We can save an awful lot of money in the budget, but only if we're willing to settle for the amenities of life that we'll find in the poorest states of the United States, like Alabama or Mississippi. I, for one, was never willing to settle for that. I'm not willing to settle for it today. Now, all of which brings me back to my main point. Perhaps Mr. Reagan's feet are set in concrete, an expression he often uses to express a statesmanlike resistance to changing his own mind. But the truth of the matter is that his foolish economies at this university and his fiscal attacks on mental health, on CalMed, on the war on poverty, on the water project, and on public recreation are the worst kind of fiscal extravagance. In the long run, his policies will cost California billions of dollars more than he's now saving, and saving is again in quotes. If Mr. Reagan's feet are set in concrete, then we must make our argument where it can be heard, and not only in California. Mr. Reagan has become a national spokesman for the harsh philosophy of government that he represents. He speaks wherever he goes to the fears and to the anxieties of his audience, and he's finding, I'm sorry to say, a growing audience. His panacea for all the ills of our society is comfortably simple. The war in Vietnam, turn it over to the military. The war on poverty, a waste of money. The right of effective dissent, unlawful and even perhaps treasonable. Now, these simple panaceas frighten me. And believe me, the task ahead for the reasonable American could not be clearer. We must convince a majority of the citizens of this state and nation that it is not a question of whether we can afford to raise the economic and social level of all Americans. It is a question of whether we can afford not to. It is not a question of whether we can afford to educate our young and care for the old. It is a question of whether we can afford not to. We live in a time of great peril and great promise, and whether the peril or the promise prevails will depend very largely on whether our feet are set in concrete or our eyes are set on a more hopeful future. I'm an optimist, but I'm also a practical man, and I know that a more hopeful future won't happen unless we make it happen. And I know that it won't happen at all if we perpetuate in government those who intensify the despair and the resentments of too many Americans, those who are not looking for honest answers, but dishonest evasions. I don't like that kind of thinking. It hurts too many people at too great cost to all of us. The right solution, the fair solution, is always the safest and least costly. The simple or cheap solution may save us a little for the moment, but the certain interest we will have to pay will do more than unbalance the budget. It will bankrupt us as a people. Now, one final word. One of my law partners told me the other day that I ought to take it a little easier on the new governor. You let Reagan bother you too much, he said. The next time that you feel a speech coming on, why don't you go out and play a round of golf? You'll feel a lot better. Now, I have to disagree with him. First, there's nothing about my golf game that's likely to lift my spirits. And second, I don't consider my more than 20 years in public life as merely an interesting career for which I'm now comfortably retired. I care what happens to California. I care very deeply about medical care for the aged, about this university, about fair housing, about the Negro demand for justice, about the right of the farm workers to organize, and many, many other things. I care very deeply, too, about the programs that I was able to set in motion during the 8 years that I was governor. And I'm not going to walk down those long green fairways of indifference while somebody else is kicking them around. I don't know that I'll ever run for public office again. I certainly will not run against my friend Tom Kuechel for the Senate. But whether my retirement for public office is permanent or not, I'm not going to retire from my convictions and from my principles. I wake up every morning and I go to bed with them every night. They'll survive my defeat last year, and they'll survive Ronald Reagan. Now, if I may return to football, I remember the late Red Saunders saying that the Bruin-Trojan game is not a matter of life and death. It's a little more important than that. The same, I believe, can be said for the philosophy of government that must prevail if we as a people are to prevail. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Brown. Those of you who have to get on to classes, well, that's understandable. If you have any questions, try to move up a little bit closer so that it'll be a lot easier to hear you. We'll wait just a second until this thing clears up. Are those mics working?
Oh, they got mics over there.
Aaron?
Yeah.
They're working. Yeah.
There are mics on both sides of the ballroom. If you have any questions, line up behind one of those and we'll take you in the order as they come. Why don't we just wait until this thing clears up? Very good. Excellent speech. Well,
What'd you have last time?
Last time we had a speaker on Asian affairs, actually. We were going to start off actually with H. Rap Brown, Louis Lomax, but he canceled out at the last moment.
Well, he couldn't come.
No, that's not true. He could have made it. He decided that Lomax was here. Yeah. That's what it's, all right, why don't we just start right now? Why don't we take the first question, Dave?
Thank you. Professor Brown?
Yes.
If I can get this thing up high enough, thank you. Well, you're right. In the first place, the topic of your speech was only coincidentally the same as the advertised topic. Now, we've heard you today attack, deride, and insult our governor. We've heard you comment on his lack of judgment. Ever since the campaign, there has been one question I have been dying to ask you, and I would like to ask you at this time.
Go right ahead.
Thank you. What relevance did the fact have in 1967 or 66? What relevance to that campaign did the fact have that it was an actor that shot Abraham Lincoln?
Well, he did, didn't he?
That's a very factual statement, sir. What relevance did it have to 1966?
Did you see the picture?
Yes.
Did you see the picture? I don't know how many of you saw the 30-minute documentary that we had, but we had a picture, and there were two little Negro girls. One was about 8, or one was about 7. I'd see these little children, I'd go up to them, and I'd say to them, listen, if you vote for Governor Reagan, he'll give you more homework, and you'll have to go to school on Saturday. And I would smile when I said it. But these little children, they were 8 or 10. I said, are you going to vote for me? And they looked at me they just looked at me they didn't know what I was talking about. As I walked away, I laughingly said, and don't forget, youngsters, an actor shot Lincoln. And that was it. And immediately the public relations people for Reagan took this as an attack upon all actors in the United States. It was silly. The expression's been used thousands of times facetiously, and I used it too. And I didn't insult Governor Reagan here in this situation. I've been trying to talk about the facts of the situation, and I intend to do it as long as I can. Go ahead. Oh, pardon me.
Now, whenever the problems of California are discussed, it seems like reference is made to the population growth. And you yourself made a couple of such references today. You said in 20 years we'd have a population of 40 million people. I wonder if you would comment on this. Is it desirable? If it's not desirable, is there anything we can do to stop it? Los Angeles does everything it can to get more industry and more people to move here. And I wonder if you could comment on our population problem.
Well, I think the question of population growth is not only a difficult one in California, but it is all over the world, as you probably know. And students of medicine and students of population growth are really trying to do something about it. I don't think that we've found the answer yet. I don't believe that there's any virtue in bigness. I see no virtue in it whatsoever, and I wish that some ways that instead of having 20 million people in the state, that we had only 10 or 12 million. I know nothing that we can do about it. As a matter of fact, as I look back on the 8 years as governor, I had to make one vital decision that might have affected the growth of I had to make many, but I had to make one particular decision that affected this entire Southern California area. I moved ahead with the California Water Project. Now, say, as I was urged to do by many in the North, don't send that water south of the Tehachapi's. And of course, we had the northern senators that could have stopped it with the aid of a newly elected governor. And if you do that, the people will move to the water rather than having the water move to the south. Now, there is a great deal of planning that can be done. In England, in these new cities, you cannot locate an industry unless there's some reasonable relationship to planning. The American public rightfully fight against any kind of governmental controls of that nature or description. But I do think that there has to be far more planning in California. How far it should go with respect to sanctions, I'm unable to say. But this basin here in Southern California can only support so many people without making it a poor place to live. I think planning is one answer. With respect to having children, that's something that's a little bit delicate at my age to discuss.
If I could just ask one more. Don't you think that it would do some good if public officials and private citizens of your stature were to speak about this problem and were to say that we have a population problem and that people should consider the effects of having more children than they possibly need, or at least bring up reference to the problem?
As a matter of fact, the pill is already doing its work, as I understand it, without any advice from Grandpa Brown. The fact is, however, that it is influencing again the affluent. They're having fewer children already, but it has had no real effect upon those that can least afford to have children. I do think people are speaking out on it, but it's an awfully tough thing to try to tell a person how many children they should have or that they shouldn't have any. I think you have to leave that one almost to the individual pointing out the facts of life. Yes, sir.
As one who has probably watched it very closely, could you explain how a 10% across the board budget cut turns into a 20% tax increase?
Well, there wasn't a 10% cut across the board. There was a substantial cut in some departments and there was a cut in others. The tax increase was in the neighborhood of $1 billion. And I must confess that no matter who'd been elected governor, there would have been a tax increase this year. Now, the governor has blamed it on to me, stating that we left the state in a deficit position. As a matter of fact, the last budget I prepared was balanced. Every bill was paid on July 1st of 1967, which was the end of the budget that I prepared and the tax program that I had, and there was a surplus at the end of that period of $100 million. But the growing population, the growing needs of the state did demand more money. I think the budget was increased too much. I think it could have been reduced about $250 million. I think withholding should have been imposed. But new taxes would have had to be imposed no matter who was the governor of the state. Yes, sir.
ex-governor or professor, I'd like to ask you regarding the FEPC. A simple question. Far too few people, from my point of view, are familiar with the destruction which the present governor has dealt with this agency. I wish that you could take a few moments to explain through his appointments what destruction he has dealt to this agency.
Thank you for asking that question. Let me just say one other thing. Governor Reagan, philosophically, and the person that spoke just a minute ago, philosophically believes that government should not do these things. I mean, they may be right. Who can tell? I mean, it is a philosophy of government that the Hoovers espoused up to 1932. It's a philosophy that's espoused now by the conservatives in the nation. And I'm not attacking their sincerity, and I'm not insulting them. I'm just saying that I disagree with them thoroughly. Fair Employment Practices Act is a bill where the government tries to advise and counsel to get people to get the minorities jobs. A person that doesn't believe in it, who cannot repeal the law, can put administrators in charge of those programs that don't believe in it either, and they sabotage it by administrative action. And that's what happened. That's happened to FEPC in the state of California. FEPC also controls the Fair Housing Act, the Rumford Act. You put real estate people on there that will lead us to Proposition 14. They're not going to operate it. They can't to save their soul. They cannot execute the intent of that law. And that's exactly what's happening with respect to FEPC. Yes, sir.
I'd like you to comment on the question of, it seems to me that Governor Reagan's cutbacks, especially in higher education, mental health, it seems to me that the greatest liberal forces against him come from the university, come from these areas. Do you think that there is any attempt then on the part of the government of Governor Reagan to cut down the liberal forces against him through the economic sanctions?
Well, I think as I stated in my speech, and as he stated during the campaign, that he does not believe in Medicare, he does not believe in Medi-Cal, and all of these things are things that he's carrying out his campaign commitments and that he promised the people that he'd do. And I think he certainly is trying to repeal these programs by administrative act rather than legislative act. I think that's exactly what he's doing with CalMed and the statements that he's made with respect to the bankrupt condition of this state. The state of California is not bankrupt. It's a rich, rich state. The people are the most affluent in the United States, and we certainly can take care of the relatively few that are in the universities and the state colleges. We certainly can take care of the crippled children. We certainly can take care of the mentally retarded and the mentally ill in this state. And when he says he can't afford it, that is just not the truth. Next question.
Yes, Professor Brown, you criticized, maybe rather you blasted the Reagan administration on points of the different cutbacks. And for example, you mentioned this drug addiction and the program you set up. I believe you mentioned Corona as one point. What would your comment be to the statement several months ago on a television interview by the president of Synanon, our group in Santa Monica, who said that Corona was absolutely useless and did no good at all because it did not take the drug addict and put him into a society and did not reform him as Synanon had?
Well, I think Synanon has done a good job, but I disagree with him with respect to Corona. They stay there from 6 months to 6 years. That is, they're committed for that period of time. We don't cure them in Corona. We dry them out. I mean, we get them to break the habit there where they can't get the drug. The cure, if I can use that term, is done on the streets with the parole agent watching them, working with them, counseling them. Very similar to the same therapeutic measures, not similar, but with the same intent that they use in Synanon. Synanon has had its failures too. Those that have left Synanon have gone to places and nobody knows what's ever happened to them. There's no way of keeping the record. They boast of all the great cures they've had, and certainly they've had them, but they haven't any way to follow through on their people. Drug addiction is a tough one. It's a tough disease to cure, and our rate of recovery is not as good as it should be, any more than our rate of recovery with the alcoholic is good either. It's very, very bad, as a matter of fact. So that's the only answer I can give you to that. Yes, sir.
Professor Brown, you've answered part of my question in that I wonder about Governor Reagan's constant attack that you left the state in a shambles, and that if he didn't balance the budget, that the state would be going to the dogs or something to this effect, and this was his justification for budget cuts in the university, etc. How true was his attacks on you that the state would go to the dogs or that the budget wasn't balanced? Were these valid claims that he made?
They were absolutely false. Every time that he makes a statement, he says that that Brown looted the Treasury. He did later apologize for that. And he made a statement the other day that we altered the books of the California Water Project. All of these things are damnable lies. That's all they are. The fact is that in the state of California, you have to have a balanced budget. It isn't like the federal government that can borrow the money or issue new currency. In the state of California, you have to collect enough in taxes, plus the money that you've been able to save over a period of years, to pay your bills. If you don't, you have to issue warrants, you have to borrow, and then you have to raise taxes to pay off those warrants. The state of California ended up this year with a surplus in the neighborhood of $100 million. The taxes that I recommended, plus the money that we saved during the 8 years, balanced the budget of the state of California. But you did run out of. The state with 200,000 more children has to increase its elementary education about $50 million. Salaries go up in private business, the state has to raise them. There are new discoveries in mental health and treatment of the retarded. You have to buy those drugs, you have to take care of them. New discoveries in medicine make medicine much more costly. All of these things cost more money, and he did have to raise the taxes, and I'm not criticizing him for that. I'm criticizing him for cutting places where it's inhumane to do it and where it's economically bad to do it.
Governor Brown, one last question then. Why haven't you publicized this a little more? I don't think that many people realize. I myself have been under the opinion that what Governor Reagan said apparently was...
Well, I'm trying two reasons. Number one, any time that I get up and make a speech against the man that defeated me, there is the sour grapes aspect of this, that this is a bitter man that feels his defeat so strongly that he's criticizing his successor. So I've tried to wait to let other people talk about the facts as I know them from the 8 years I was Attorney General and the 8 years I was governor. But I've decided that no one is taking the leadership in the Democratic Party. And I intend to take it not against Reagan, but for things that I believe in, things that I worked for a period of 8 years, and that I see him destroying and hurting human beings at the present time. Whatever people may think with respect to my motives, that's something that I can't control. Yes, sir.
Mr. Brown, I have a sympathetic question with regard to your defeat last year. You placed the blame on the suburban vote swinging to Republicans and to Governor Reagan, but I think there is a complementary thesis which should be discussed. You mentioned that you support in principle the farm workers' right to organize, and it's my understanding that you were instrumental in bringing DeGiorgio and the National Farm Workers Association together for the first major contract, and it's my understanding that Cesar Chavez officially supported you as the candidate for governor. But this took a long time, and there was what appeared to be a great deal of equivocation, and in the meantime, families were hurt and people were on strike, and the farm workers and the friends of farm workers became incredibly cynical about your principles, and therefore sat on their hands for the election.
It didn't take, I think you're absolutely right. They, in Kern County with the strikers, I lost both the strikers, the farm workers, and I also lost the farmers. But we did not equivocate in that. I was working all the time with our Department of Employment. Every move that I made during the period I was governor was an effort to raise the standards of the farm workers. in these strike situations, a governor can't move into all of the strikes that are going on throughout the state. The only thing that I didn't do on Easter Sunday, when I had my family, they demanded that I be present at a march that they had to Sacramento. I said to them, I'll see you on Saturday or I'll see you on Monday. They wouldn't take either Saturday or Monday. I was going to fly up to Sacramento. But on Easter Sunday, I traditionally spent it with my family, and I saw no reason to do it, and I didn't do it. This infuriated them, and they took me on, and I never resulted. But I deny that I ever equivocated. I was in the background trying to get DeGiorgio to reason and work with these people, not only in the DeGiorgio situation, but in every move with respect to the farm workers. But it's like a lot of the other things you do. Unless you can do everything, you lose even those that you try to help, and you sometimes fail. I think the riots have hurt the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party traditionally, the Lyndon Johnsons, the John Kennedys are the people, and the Pat Browns are the ones that have tried to raise the standards to try to give that rightful assistance to minorities. And still, the riots hurt us more. In the University of California, we stood for free speech in the university. We stood for it up there at Berkeley. But the result of the disturbances up there were a reaction against a governor that was trying to defend the students, because the students in some of those cases went too far. They said, let's put somebody in there that's got backbone, that'll throw these kids out or put them in jail. This is what they had to say. So that's the effect of it.
Let me just expand it
Sure.
briefly. I don't think the Democratic Party can recover itself by appealing to the middle with more sophisticated economic arguments. It seems to me, realistically speaking, as a politician, you would recognize the need to have those block organizations, those people who are willing, for some reason, to work 14 hours a day during campaigns, who are willing to do the dirty work which Reagan was so successful at setting up, because he could appeal to people who take issues of the right very seriously.
That's right. I think
how can the Democratic Party, again, given its present position, hope to appeal to people on the left who take issues very seriously enough to work again 14 hours a day and to do the kind of work the party needs, or it is irrelevant?
I think that a little more of the Reagan conservatism will so infuriate the moderate person and the left, if I can put it that way, that they'll rise up with the zeal that they had during the days of Roosevelt, during the days of John Kennedy, and that we've apparently retreated on during the past 2 years. I agree with you. This is rather a sophisticated argument, but I think it's going to work. I hope so anyway. Yes, sir.
Governor, I wonder if you could give me a numerical approximation of how many people rejected both major parties in the 1966 election to vote for peace candidates.
To vote for a hate candidate?
Peace candidate.
Oh, a peace candidate. How many will, or how many?
How many did in 1966?
I think a very substantial number of people rejected both Reagan and myself because they disagreed with my support of President Johnson, and I think they sat in their hands during this campaign. And I think too that the difference, the position of President Johnson with respect to Vietnam is hurting and I've been supporting it, the efforts that he's making, but I still say factually that that's hurting the Democratic Party, not only in California but throughout the United States.
So you think then that the influence of these people was more important because they didn't work for the Democratic Party rather than because they didn't vote for the Democratic Party?
Well, I think both. I can't weigh the effect of people taking a sit out on the campaign. I certainly think that it hurt me far more than it hurt Governor Reagan. It was not only the peace issue, but when I recommended a commission to study the effect of the Rumford bill, I also lost a great many other liberals at that time who felt that this was equivocating at that time. When, as a matter of fact, the report that we made, the report when it came out, strengthened the Rumford bill and had the effect of I think, preventing its repeal at this session of the legislature. But the liberals didn't understand that. They thought I was guilty of some sort of political shenanigans. And of course, in politics, where people, 2/3 of the people voted against FEPC, you are trying to convince them. How do you do it? How do you change a majority like that? Yes, sir.
Yeah. Last year of General Eisenhower's year in office, he made a farewell speech, and he said that the greatest threat to the United States and the free world at that time was the apparent growth of the real growth of the military-industrial complex. Later on, or prior to that time, he had gone to Korea and helped end that war. And just recently, he made a statement about sending some more troops over there. But in view of what he had said at that time, in view of our growing military power around the world, and our actions in Vietnam and Guatemala and Dominican Republic, Congo, and elsewhere, and the fact that it doesn't seem to be bringing us any closer to any peaceful existence on this planet, what would you suggest as some first steps to a reduction in military tension?
I heard President Eisenhower last night speak on television, and he said he believed in the doctrine of fair pursuit. He believed that when they cross across the border into a neutral country, that we'd have the right to pursue that. This is, of course, a more extreme position than President Johnson has taken by far. I do remember that statement, and I do think that President Johnson, with the help of Secretary of Defense McNamara, has kept the military separated apart, and he has kept governmental control of the military. And I agree with that position. What can be done to bring peace in this troubled world would take a long, long speech, and I haven't the answer to it. I don't know what should be done. You talk about the Dominican Republic and Guatemala and some of these other places. I know too that the communists have financed and supported violence in countries that would make other decisions by democratic means. I think the communists are not without blame in a great many of these things, even though they may think that this is the only way of life. I don't know how people are going to do it, but I don't believe in war. I don't think it's doing a single solitary bit of good, and I do hope that the United Nations can bring about a greater understanding. But we've been working at it for a long, long time, and it seems to me that we do have more violence in the world. But the answer to it escapes me. I just can't tell you what I think should be done, other than prayer. I think there's only two more questions, that's all.
Well, sir,
yes.
You say you support the rights of oppressed minorities.
What was that?
You say you support the rights of oppressed minorities. Well, how do you feel about the present-day abortion laws?
The what?
The present-day abortion laws. Do you think these are completely out of touch with reality?
You mean the amendments that were made at the recent session of the legislature?
Yes.
Well, I would have signed the bill if I were governor, but I would have disagreed with it. I know that this is a position that will deny it, but I had a little experience. If you got a minute, let me just tell you about it. When I was district attorney of San Francisco, we had an illegal abortion mill running in San Francisco, and this woman was performing about 15 to 20 abortions a day. We raided her. We tried before a jury on two different occasions. The first time was 11-1 conviction. The second time was 7-5. By the third time the trial came up, it was 10 months after we'd raided the place. At that time, when we went in there and raided this abortion parlor in San Francisco, there were 15 women waiting to be aborted, waiting to have an operation by this non-doctor. And we took their name and addresses. We went back to see them 10 months later. Every one of those 10 had their babies. Every one of them said, "Thank God you were there the day that we went in there and we had that little baby." I just want to say that it's a tough thing to determine who should live or who should not live. And I don't believe that any law can do it. I just don't believe in it. But where a majority of the legislators voted for it and the people were for it, I certainly would have signed the bill, and I wouldn't have let my religious beliefs interfere with what the majority had voted for. Yes.
Yes, Professor Brown, I don't condone Governor Reagan's lack of sympathy and interest for a general poverty program like the War on Poverty. But I think I'd like to know what you feel about there's a general feeling that the War on Poverty, the government's program, just simply isn't functioning right, isn't working. The money that's allotted for the spending for committees and investigators to go in and work with people in the states, the local areas.
I agree that the War on Poverty has not done all that it should, but because you can't do everything, that doesn't mean you shouldn't do something. I think it's too little. I don't think they're doing enough. I don't think that in the experimental stages where it's been for the last 3 or 4 years that it's been right. But the principle is good, and over a period of time, the administration of it will be improved. And I don't think that you would repeal the poverty program because of some difficulty. The Operation Head Start has been excellent. The teenage programs have been good. The legal assistance that's been given to individuals, the work that they've done in neighborhood centers, the work that they've been doing in retraining some of these young people, the job things that they've been doing, all in all, it's a plus, not a minus.
Do you think that there can be more cooperation between these federal committees and the state, local governments?
Yes, much more, and there has to be. But this whole federal-state relationship is in a limbo at the present time. The states did it all at first. Then they gradually turned, by reason of lack of finances, to the federal government. The federal government has gotten so big now, you have to return it to the states. You have to have some way to make the states the real coordinating force throughout the United States. And I can tell you that movements are in that direction at the present time. I think that's all, and thank you very, very much. Excellent audience.
On behalf of the students, Governor, I want to thank you very much for taking time out and coming here. Thank you.